If our history teachers covered everything straight up, our classes would have taken twice as long and probably come with way more disclaimers. Because somewhere between the empires and revolutions, there were dentists creating electric currents in people's mouths, government shipping mountains of gold across oceans, and at least one woman in Imperial Russia who allegedly ran a murder-for-hire service for unhappy wives. Every fact on today's list is real, documented, and usually got left out because it would derail the lesson immediately. So what do you say? Are you up for some derailments? Because I'm Michael, this is 25, and these are 25 absurd facts history teachers never mention. 25. The exploding teeth. Let's just jump right into it. As much as I'm sure we all love going to the dentist, those who paved the way for us didn't have it as easy. In the 1800s, a serious toothache usually meant crude dental work, and cavities often got patched with whatever metals dentists had on hand. So, in a handful of documented cases, that treatment was followed by something far worse. Those teeth often ended up aching for weeks or months until they suddenly cracked apart. And I mean gunshot-like apart. In fact, one Pennsylvania dentist actually recorded a few of the exploding incidents, including one where the force of the fracture almost knocked a woman off her feet. It took them a while, but it eventually started to make sense. Those early fillings were often made from mixed metals like lead, tin, silver, and zinc. When different metals sat in saliva, they could create a small electrical current. In other words, the dentist turned people's mouths into low-voltage batteries, something that it could have produced gas inside a weakened tooth, building pressure until it popped. Luckily, there have been no confirmed cases since the early 1900s, which is probably the only comforting part of this story. 24. Liberia's Guinness World Record. If you've ever heard someone say an election result looks suspicious, Liberia's 1927 presidential race puts that complaint into perspective. At the time, only about 15,000 people were eligible to vote. When the results were announced, the sitting president had over 230,000 votes. The result was accepted as is and went down in history for exactly what it was. The Guinness World Records later recognized the election as the most fraudulent ever measured by numbers alone. No other election has ever come close to producing more votes than voters on that scale. 23. Friars and Monks. Not everyone is Roman Catholic, so for a lot of us, the confusion over who these guys are and what they actually do is very real. That confusion only gets worse if you grew up watching older movies where friars and monks all look like the same robed guy. In short, the difference comes down to how they live. Monks stay inside monastery walls, committing to a life built around prayer, routine, and separation from the outside world. Friars, on the other hand, are meant to be out among the people. They travel, preach, teach, and offer services in communities, rather than living in one permanent place. Instead of owning land or relying on long-term income, they depend on donations and local support. So, monks stay put, and friars stay mobile. 22. The Great Gold Escape. Have you ever heard of Operation Fish? In 1940, with Nazi forces advancing across Europe, the UK decided the safest place for its gold was on an island, rather than with the Luftwaffe. So the powers that be launched a plan that involved loading enormous amounts of gold into crates, onto warships, and sending it across the Atlantic to Canada. The crates were labeled as fish, for security reasons, which meant dock workers in Halifax ended up unloading one of the most valuable shipments on Earth while thinking it was seafood. Every convoy crossed waters full of German submarines, and somehow none of the gold ships were lost. By the time it was over, Britain shipped more than 186,000 gold bars and over 8 million ounces of gold coins overseas, and Canada ended up guarding one of the largest gold stockpiles in the world for the duration of the war. 21. The first fossil detective. Around 500 BCE, a Greek philosopher and poet named Xenophanes started noticing something odd. He kept finding fish fossils and seashells far inland, nowhere near the sea, and had a refreshingly straightforward epiphany. Those places must have been underwater at some point. Instead of blaming gods or myths, he treated fossils like clues and became the first known person to use physical evidence to explain geological change. At the time, that kind of thinking was a massive change. He had interesting ideas about other areas of our lives too. For example, he pointed out that most people usually imagine their gods look and act just like they do. The Greeks pictured Greek gods and so on. Xenophanes even joked that if horses could draw, their gods would probably look like horses. 20. America's first kidnapping for ransom. Most of us learned about kidnapping for ransom stories from cases like the Lindbergh baby or Patty Hearst. But the idea had to start somewhere. And that somewhere was 1874, when a 4-year-old boy named Charlie Ross was kidnapped outside his family's home in Pennsylvania. It was the first time Americans had ever seen a ransom note tied to a kidnapping, and quite simply, it shocked the whole country. Despite massive searches, ransom negotiations, and years of false leads, Charlie was never found. His disappearance became so widely known that parents across the U.S. started warning their children about strangers for the first time. And you know that phrase, "don't take candy from strangers"? Yeah, that's also where that came from. 19. America, according to Japan. Foreigners have a weird idea of what America looks and works like, and we can blame Hollywood for most of that. I think. But this kind of thing isn't new at all. In 1861, a Japanese writer and artist teamed up to create an illustrated history of the United States based on almost entirely secondhand information. The result looked less like a textbook and more like a fantasy epic. They pictured George Washington firing bows and arrows, punching tigers, and standing beside a goddess who represented America itself. John Adams was shown battling giant snakes, while Benjamin Franklin casually fired a cannon he held with his bare hands. It reflected how America was viewed from the outside at the time, and just how mysterious it seemed from across the ocean. 18. The 1626 Beijing Explosion. Our absurd history isn't always fun or pleasant. Sometimes the stories are strange simply because they're hard to explain. In 1626, something like that happened in Beijing. What, in all likelihood, began as an industrial accident turned into one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. A blast from a Ming Dynasty weapon depot wiped out massive sections of the city, killed tens of thousands of people, and left witnesses describing debris falling from the sky and a huge cloud hanging over the capital. Nearly 400 years later, historians still debate the exact cause, though most agree it involved a catastrophic ignition of stored gunpowder inside the armory. 17. Pressed to death. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft at the age of 81. When the court asked him to enter a plea, he refused to say anything at all. That decision triggered a punishment known as peine faute de Dieu, which is basically a legal tactic meant to force someone to cooperate, because the legal system had no other way to proceed unless he spoke. Corey was laid on the ground, a wooden board was placed on his chest, and heavy stones were added on top of it one by one over several days. The idea was to make him talk, but he did the opposite and kept asking for more weight. He died under the stones on September 19, 1692, without ever entering a plea or being convicted, which ultimately meant that the authorities could not legally seize his land. 16. A very final marriage solution. Okay, I hinted at this one at the beginning. Is it the truth? Who knows? But it was credible enough to appear in the New York Times in 1909, so there has to be something to the story, right? According to reports from the time, a woman known as Madame Popova offered a very specific service in Imperial Russia. Wealthy women trapped in abusive marriages could allegedly pay her to make their husbands disappear. Sometimes she handled the job herself. Other times she supposedly arranged it through hired killers. The numbers attached to her name grew with every retelling, eventually reaching into the hundreds. Whether she was one person, several people, or a story infiltrated by sensational journalism is still debated. But something clearly happened to those men, even if the details were exaggerated along the way. 15. Churchill imagined a different America. When Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, it wasn't for a novel or a poem. It was for the way he wrote our actual history, especially his massive first-hand account of World War II. But what most people don't realize is that Churchill also liked to mess around with history a bit. Years earlier, he wrote an alternate history piece envisioning what would have happened if a major battle in the American Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, had gone the other way. Basically just asking, what if this turned out differently? It's not something you'd expect from Churchill, but he clearly enjoyed asking what if every now and then. 14. When being nice worked. During World War II, most of the captured Japanese soldiers had never been told what prisoners' rights were. In their military mindset, surrender came with so much shame that capture itself already felt like the end of the world. So when prisoners were given decent food, medical care, and basic respect, the situation completely transformed their expectations. Some of them began sharing information almost immediately. Others were convinced that their cooperation was simply part of being captured, so questioning sessions often drifted into ordinary conversations, and all the secret details about their units, supply routes, and troop movements came out along the way. The complete cultural misunderstanding ended up producing a steady flow of intelligence. 13. Sweden's Dagen H. On September 3, 1967, Sweden decided to stop driving on the left side of the road and switch to the right, all in one morning. Most Swedish cars were already built for right-side driving, so sharing borders with neighbors who drove on the right side started creating real safety problems. At exactly 4:50 a.m., every vehicle in the country had to pull over and stop. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. Then, when the clock hit 5, everyone slowly pulled back out onto the road on the opposite side. To make it work, Sweden rewrote the rulebook overnight. More than 350,000 road signs were replaced, traffic lights were reconfigured, and buses got brand new doors on the other side. Around 130,000 volunteers, police officers, soldiers, and even school children were stationed across the country to point drivers in the right direction. Even the elk hunting season got moved. The country's accident rates actually dropped in the weeks after the switch, and it ended up being a massive success. 12. The Count of Auschwitz. Charles Coward was a British soldier captured by the Germans in 1940, and by 1943, he somehow ended up assigned to Auschwitz. What makes his story absurd is not just that he survived, but that the Nazis trusted him. Because he spoke fluent German, they made him the Red Cross liaison for British prisoners, which meant he could move around parts of the camp that most of the inmates never saw. That access turned into a loophole. Coward used the Red Cross supplies to bribe the guards, passed coded letters to the British War Office, and helped some of the Jewish prisoners slip out of forced death marches using stolen clothes and papers from the dead. By his own estimate, hundreds of people walked out alive because the system thought he was harmless. 11. The real power behind Genghis Khan. Everyone's heard the name Genghis Khan. Again, he wasn't English or anything. He would have pronounced his name Genghis Khan, not Genghis Khan. Anyway, if you've been watching our channel for a while, you'll be well aware that his conquest killed so many people that some researchers believe they caused a short-term global cooling. He has tens of millions of descendants worldwide and hundreds of millions across Asia. But, as with all things history, there's always more to the story. Genghis was a badass, alright, but a lot of his success came down to the people he had with him. One of the most formidable was Subutai. He joined the Mongol army as a teen and went on to win 65 major battles across more than 20 wars, helping bring down entire empires along the way. One campaign alone had his forces marching over 5,000 miles in a massive loop around the Caspian Sea, fighting and conquering as they went. By the time he fully retired in his 70s, Subutai had helped build the largest connected land empire the world has ever seen, all without ever trying to rule any of it himself. 10. The Hiroshima Bonsai. One of the oldest trees at the National Bonsai and Beijing Museum is a Japanese white pine that's been growing since the early 1600s. What makes it unusual isn't just its age, but where it happened to be during World War II. The tree belonged to bonsai grower Masaru Yamaki and was sitting in his family's nursery in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb was dropped in 1945. It survived because it happened to be shielded by a surrounding wall. In 1976, Yamaki donated the pine, along with 53 other bonsai, to the United States as part of the American Bicentennial. At the time, no one mentioned the tree's wartime history. That detail only came out in 2001 when Yamaki's grandchildren visited the museum and recognized it. By then, the tree had already spent decades on display, with no one realizing what it had lived through. 9. The world's most casual diamond. Mir Osman Ali Khan, the last Nizam of Hyderabad, was one of the richest people who ever lived. His personal fortune made today's modern billionaires look modest, with estimates putting it somewhere between $200 and $230 billion in today's money, enough to rival the economies of entire countries. He ruled a massive princely state, had his own currency, his own mint, and vaults packed with gold and jewels. And yet, he used one of the largest diamonds in the world, Jacob Diamond, as a paperweight, simply because he didn't see any reason to lock it away. He had so much wealth that it eventually lost its novelty completely. 8. The Siege of Baghdad. In 1258, the Mongols reached Baghdad, which at the time was one of the most important cities on Earth. It wasn't just a capital, but also a center of learning, full of scholars, translators, scientists, and libraries that had been accumulating knowledge for centuries. The most famous of these was the House of Wisdom, where texts from Greece, Persia, India, and the Islamic world were studied and preserved. When the city fell, the conquerors took thousands of books and texts and threw them into the Tigris River. They threw so many works into the water that accounts at the time said that the water turned black from all the ink. A massive portion of the written record from the Arabic Golden Age was destroyed in a matter of days. 7. An empire ruined by corn. For a brief stretch of time, the city of Cahokia was bigger than London and dominated the Mississippi River region. Its centerpiece, Monk's Mound, is actually the largest earthen structure in North America to this day, towering over a city that once had markets, ceremonies, and tightly organized neighborhoods. So on the surface, it looks like a flawless success story for early urban life in North America. But underneath it all, the city ran on corn. Corn fueled the city's population growth, their political power, and daily survival, but according to a few researchers, it also locked Cahokia into a fragile system. As the maize farming intensified, the land took a hit. The people's diets became less diverse, their health declined, and, well, from what we can see, the people simply left. Cahokia thinned out over time until the city just stopped functioning as a city. 6. The absolutely fireproof theater. If there's one lesson history keeps repeating, it's that absolute safety claims never stay absolute for long. The people from the Titanic might have been a bit more careful if they had remembered what happened in 1903. When the Iroquois Theater opened in Chicago, it was proudly advertised as absolutely fireproof. That claim was printed everywhere, repeated in ads, and used to reassure nervous audiences. 37 days later, the building proved how meaningless those words were. As stage fire spread in seconds, exits were locked or hidden, fire escapes led nowhere, and the crowd had no real way out. By the end of the night, 602 people were dead. It remains the deadliest single building fire in U.S. history. 5. The only successful U.S. coup d'etat. Yes, there has been a successful coup d'etat in the U.S. We just don't like to talk about it. On November 10, 1898, a large group of armed white supremacists moved through the city of Wilmington after weeks of threats and political pressure, targeting a multiracial local government that had been ejected just a few days earlier. They burned down a black-owned newspaper, attacked black neighborhoods, and forced elected officials, both black and white, to resign or flee. Afterward, the attackers installed their own leaders in the city government and pushed through new voting restrictions across North Carolina, including poll taxes and literacy tests, which removed a lot of the black citizens from the voter rolls. Those voting restrictions stayed in place for several decades, until the poll taxes were banned in 1964 and the literacy tests were finally struck down by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 4. The Meteor Storm of 1833. In November 1833, almost everyone living across large parts of the United States thought the end of times had finally arrived. Ordinary meteor showers might produce a few dozen shooting stars in an hour, but that year, the Leonid meteor storm delivered tens of thousands of meteors streaking across the sky every single hour. People ran into the streets screaming. Churches filled before dawn with people confessing sins. Camp meetings broke out on the spot. Some people fell to their knees and prayed openly in their fields and town squares. Others wrote farewell letters, convinced they would be dead by morning. And then, the sky simply went back to normal. Thankfully, we now know the Earth had just passed through a debris field, but for the people who lived through it, the night must have been absolutely terrifying. 3. The Almond Heists. Okay, this is more recent history, but if I told you organized crime was making serious money off almonds, you'd probably think it was a joke. However, in California, it's become a reoccurring problem. The state grows around 80% of the world's almonds, and that has turned a simple farm product into something surprisingly valuable. A single truckload can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It takes up almost no space, and it's easy to resell once it disappears. Multiple theft rings have figured this out. Starting in the early 2010s, they became pros at making fake paperwork, forging delivery orders, and redirecting shipments mid-route. In some cases, investigators have even traced stolen almond profits to international criminal networks. 2. People used to live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. They're actually still doing it to this day. Most people think of the Grand Canyon as a place you visit and then leave. But tucked nearly 3,000 feet down is Supai Village, the heart of the Havasupai Indian Reservation, where a few hundred people live year-round. There's no road in or out, so everything has to come down on foot, by helicopter, or on the backs of pack animals. Most famously, Supai is also the only place in the United States where the U.S. Postal Service still delivers the mail by mule train. Several times a week, a string of mules plods 8 miles down the canyon with everything from letters and packages to food and medicine for the members of the community. 1. The Quack who blinded the masters. In the 1700s, eye surgery was basically a confidence game, and John Taylor played it better than anyone. He traveled across Europe in a fancy carriage, called himself a world-class eye doctor, and talked his way into treating the rich and famous. The problem was that he had no idea what he was doing. His cataract treatments were usually rushed, incredibly painful, and totally unsafe. Patients would walk in with blurry vision and walk out completely blind. Among his most famous patients, or should I say victims, were George Friedrich Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach, two of the most important composers in history, both of whom lost their sight after trusting Taylor with their eyes. He died rich and famous and was never held accountable. And that brings me to the end. Did you guys actually know about Handel and Bach going blind? I would love to hear your takes in the comments below. And if you're actually just getting started, I might have a great follow-up video for you. Our related one, 25 Strange Facts You Definitely Didn't Learn in School, has a few more of the stranger stories in our world's history, including how far back cannibalism actually goes. Fair warning though, it's probably not one for the kids. The link to that video should be appearing right about here in just a few seconds. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like, share, comment, subscribe with that notification bell so you never miss out on any new content. And I will see you guys again real soon.